When you think that Sanatan Dharma, also known as Hinduism, is the third largest religious tradition, we were hardly there. My inquiries have revealed that our involvement in the preparation and the plans for this particular event was minimal, and representation on the day, there was only one session where we actively had a Hindu leader given an opportunity to speak and address the whole audience, and that was the opening plenary session. And then after that, there was nothing in the core conference except there were fringe events. And in the fringe events, we had one or two opportunities to speak, but it was virtually negligible. There was not a Hindu voice appropriate to the third largest religious tradition and one of the oldest, if not the oldest, of the divine traditions. This was the conference where the apology that Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, made to the indigenous people in Canada for atrocities inflicted upon them. This was a conference where an announcement could have been made of what tangible changes were going to be done and what programs were going to be introduced. There was nothing there. And the list goes on. I was really hoping that somebody would deal with the hugely inadequate and very damaging Open Doors report, which was published by the APPG for Freedom of Religion and Belief, the hosts of this conference. But nobody spoke about it. In that report, they criticized India for its record for the first time, and the evidence was anecdotal. It was another piece of atrocity literature that should have been dealt with at this conference. I could go on. When I got, shall we say, I stepped back and saw a sense of what was going on, it struck me that Hinduphobia, or anti-Hinduism, as I prefer to call it, should have been center stage. That should have been center stage. It's at the heart of healing the Hindu-Christian, British-India relationship, and yet it wasn't spoken about. What it struck me when I stepped back and had a look at it, what I really felt was this was a conference at which the classic white savior Christian identity reared its head from every corner of the globe. It came together, and with that desire to do so much good, that virtue signaling that seems to manifest when these characters get together, it was a government-funded, public-sponsored, evangelical missionary meeting, masquerading as an interfaith exercise. It should be really noted that this issue about ministers of politics meeting ministers of religion, that should ring alarm bells. If you have a secular state, if you have a state where those two are separated, there is absolutely no reason why ministers of religion from institutions which have horrific human rights records historically, they have terrible abuse and pastoral issues which they haven't been able to address. In fact, the concealment of abuse of vulnerable adults has been repeatedly reported. We've had 5 reports in this country into the abuse by the Church of England of its vulnerable charges and youngsters and vulnerable adults, and not a thing has been done. Yes. And until that's done, they should not have access to the public purse. They should not have access to policy making.
Jai Shri Krishna, Namaste, and welcome to Citti Media's Current Affairs Show. Today we'll be talking about the Ministerial Forbes conference that was held in London this week. And to discuss matters further, we have our in-house Pandit Satish Sharma ji. Pandit ji, welcome.
Namaskar, Slonaji, Pranam, Jai Shri Ram to you. Yes, thank you for inviting me to speak on this issue. This Forbes conference, as you've called it, Freedom of Religion and Belief. I think the full title of the conference was the International Conference on Freedom of Religion and Belief. And as you have indicated, it was a huge and very important event. And it concluded the day before yesterday. So we've got lots to talk about it. There were some good things, there were some not so good things, and some things that were deeply concerning.
Sure. So this conference was attended by world leaders, world religious leaders. It had a huge build up, lots of advertising. We were all looking forward to matters being resolved, being discussed, coming to the forefront. Um, it, how do you feel it went, and how do you feel Hindus were represented in this conference?
Mm. Well, they're the two most important things. Firstly, you've mentioned lots of ministers coming together at this event. Now, there were ministers from the government and there were ministers from religious traditions. And you're quite right, they came together and they talked for the best part of 3 days. Now, there is a warning bell that rings in my mind whenever we get politicians and religious leaders sitting together. And that warning bell is that history has taught us that in the West, certainly, in the Abrahamist traditions, definitely, secularity is the separation of religion and state. And the two should not interface with each other in a manner which causes influence. It's a big problem. Theocracies are something that have plagued humanity for a long time. We had almost 14, 1500 years of dictatorship by divine rule, and that has never ended well. And so I was a bit concerned at the idea that the British government would be using taxpayers' money to fund a gathering of global religious leaders. So there was an alarm bell in my mind in the first instance. What I was really hoping would not happen would be that the predator traditions, those who are, shall we say, those who have a history of ethnocide and erasing pagan First Nation religious traditions, and those who, even to this day, are very much concerned with evangelism, as they call it, proselytization, and religious ethnocide. I was worried that they would be funded from the public purse. And so I was looking for that and for signs of that. And to a significant degree, I think my concerns were actually justified. There was an overrepresentation of Christian and Muslim traditions. The Christian evangelical traditions were just, they swamped the event. There were representatives from the Christian traditions over in the United States, obviously from the UK, they were heavily presented. But when you think that Sanatan Dharma, also known as Hinduism, is the third largest religious tradition, we were hardly there. My inquiries have revealed that our involvement in the preparation and the plans for this particular event was minimal, and representation on the day, there was only one session where we actively had a Hindu leader given an opportunity to speak and address the whole audience, and that was the opening plenary session. And then
Oh,
after that, there was nothing in the core conference except there were fringe events. And in the fringe events, we had one or two opportunities to speak, but it was virtually negligible. There was not, there was not a Hindu voice appropriate to the third largest religious tradition and one of the oldest, if not the oldest, of the divine traditions. So that was quite disappointing. And to some degree, I wasn't surprised.
it's quite concerning that Hindus are used as a tick box tokenism representative rather than addressing our concerns, because recently religion has shown what how troublesome it can be in general society and the civil unrest it can cause. This would have been the ideal platform to bring those issues to the surface. Where are they going wrong? Why are they just ticking the box to have a token Hindu representing what is a very serious issue?
Well, there are two dimensions to that very, very important question, Saloniji. One is that our own representation is so inadequate. It is weak, it is not coherent, and it very rarely has a grounding in the deeper parts of our religious traditions, our wisdom traditions. And so, more often than not, it tends to end up as being religious eye candy, interfaith eye candy. You know, we have to have a photograph. And in that photograph, we need some brown people. So, yes, we can pull these people in. We have to have some brown people from the various traditions. Who can we pull in who's not going to rock the boat? Who can we pull in who's not going to make us feel uncomfortable? And those tend to be the voices that the government and the interfaith industry in this country tend to look for. And you could see exactly that situation represented, and that manifested in this conference. The other side of it is that our own organizations, sadly, are not up to the mark. We should, at this time in our position in this country, have transparency in our organizations. We should have regular elections. We should have accountability. We should have the opportunity for each organization to consult with its members, find the best voices, and then put the best people on for that particular task in front of the cameras and onto the podiums and have them speak. But sadly, we are not there. So, to a large degree, we too are to blame. But I have to also suggest that the government and the interfaith industry doesn't, shall we say, go out of its way to ensure that we have good voices and that there is adequate representation. They're more than happy to have token Hindus with two O's to fill those slots. And this has to change.
Yes, no, absolutely. Because recently we've had the sad beheading of Kanhaiya Lalji. We've had a fantastic reception to the film, The Kashmir Files, that highlighted the persecution of Kashmiri Hindus in Kashmir, the 7 exoduses that they've suffered. It's very disappointing that you have such a huge platform like this. And as you say, Hindus are not being represented, neither externally nor internally. And we aren't there yet. What steps could we take to be getting there? Because a platform like this media channel, for example, is a fantastic platform for people to hear other Hindus speak. Because you're right, we do not have an electoral system, we don't have accountability. How can we actually move forward in a productive way from here?
This is going to be the challenge in front of us. And I think it's a challenge that a group of people have now decided has to be addressed. We're hoping that the organizations will look at this issue and themselves decide that this is so important for us. You've mentioned the beheadings of Kanhaiya Lal. There are so many incidences. The Hindu community has been, shall we say, the target of genocide for almost 1,200 years. It's the longest running genocide, and the loss of life is running into the hundred of millions. We've been targeted by Abrahamist traditions. We've been targeted by the communist traditions, etc., the anti-religious traditions. And the focus has really been not only to, shall we say, erase our physical presence, the number of people, but also to erase our history. And this is not being taken into account. This conference was exactly the opportunity to address those issues. You know, I was hoping that somebody would stand up and be given a platform to talk about hate speech. You know, the word
Yes.
kufr, unbeliever, infidel, you know, idol worshipper, all of these are actually hate speech. They are
Yes.
tropes which were created to create scorn and contempt for Hindus, and they are present in such volumes and in so many places that it's become normalized. I thought somebody should speak about this at this conference. I
Yes.
was hoping that our leaders would do. Ethnocide, the erasure of our indigenous traditions during colonialism, during the Anglican British occupation of Bharat, of India, that should have been raised at this conference. There were times when it was clear that there was a herd of elephants, you know, in the room, and the traditions were tiptoeing, doing everything possible with bland smiles, but trying to make sure that nobody disturbed that herd of elephants. It was so well curated and manicured that only certain things were given the opportunity to be aired. You know, this was the conference at which the religious abuse of authority should have been spoken about. This was the conference at which the abuse of vulnerable adults and children should have been spoken about. The systemic institutional abuse of young minors should have been spoken about. You know, this was the conference where the conversation should have started about the Church of England and its £10 billion worth of revenues derived from the slave trade, and perhaps some sort of restitution spoken about. This was the conference where the apology that Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, made to the indigenous people in Canada for atrocities inflicted upon them This was a conference where an announcement could have been made of what tangible changes were going to be done and what programs were going to be introduced. There was nothing there. And the list goes on. I was really hoping that somebody would deal with the hugely inadequate and very damaging Open Doors report, which was published by the APPG for Freedom of Religion and Belief, the hosts of this conference. But nobody spoke about it. In that report, they criticized India for its record for the first time, and the evidence was anecdotal. It was another piece of atrocity literature that should have been dealt with at this conference. I could go on. You know, when I got, shall we say, I stepped back and saw a sense of what was going on, it struck me that Hinduphobia, or anti-Hinduism, as I prefer to call it, should have been center stage. That should have been center stage. It's at the heart of healing the Hindu, Christian, British India relationship, and yet it wasn't spoken about. What it struck me when I stepped back and had a look at it, what I really felt was this was a conference at which the classic white savior Christian identity reared its head from every corner of the globe. It came together, and with that desire to do so much good, that virtue signaling that seems to manifest when these characters get together. It was a government-funded, public-sponsored, evangelical missionary meeting, masquerading as an interfaith exercise. And I say that because none of the issues, none of the key issues which cause friction, which cause loss of life, which cause hatred, not a single one of them was addressed directly. And that is a huge problem.
Yes, no, it's very uncomfortable, like you said, because we need to ask these uncomfortable questions when you have such an echelon of people uniting for a purpose. But as you say, it seems to be like a glossy tick box event where nothing really conclusive has come out of it that's positive. Nothing has changed.
Yeah, as I say, we have to take responsibility first and put our own house in order before we can then bring the government to account. And that really was a huge disappointment. In fact, if I recall, the plenary speaker didn't mention Hinduphobia, didn't mention the spate of beheadings, didn't mention the appearance of blasphemy laws in India, in essence, if not in word. And all of these are such important issues, and it's our difficulty, it's our lack that we have to address, that they weren't mentioned. There was only one, if I recall, there was only one contribution, and that came from the floor of the House when one of our prominent journalists, Kapil Dudakia, he actually stood up and made a short statement, which was very well received. And he too said that, you know, the majority traditions are very much involved in what's going on, but there is a herd of elephants in this room. And when are we genuinely going to start to speak truth to power, as opposed to continue speaking about truth to power? And that was a very powerful statement. And apart from that, there was, I think, very little which reflected the voice of the Sanatani community in the United Kingdom, nor indeed internationally. Hugely disappointing, a wasted opportunity, a lost opportunity.
Sure. Initially, you touched upon the religious ministers meeting the political ministers. How do you feel about religion and politics mixing? Because we do see other faiths doing this now. And maybe is it something that Hindus should be following, or should it still be kept separate?
Again, fantastic question, Saloniji. You know, dharma is a completely different darshan, a different way of looking at these things. And if you look at everything with a dharmic lens, then science and religion, the separation disappears. Once the separation between science and religion disappears, you're left with experiential reality. And on the basis of experiential reality, you can decide how to allocate your resources. On the basis of dharmic principles, you can ensure equality, etc. It's automatically built into the perception. And so a dharmic perspective is still light years ahead of this conflict between religion and state. But it should be really noted that this issue about ministers of politics meeting ministers of religion, that should ring alarm bells. If you have a secular state, if you have a state where those two are separated, there is absolutely no reason why ministers of religion from institutions which have horrific human rights records historically, they have terrible abuse and pastoral issues which they haven't been able to address. In fact, the concealment of abuse of vulnerable adults has been repeatedly reported. We've had 5 reports in this country into the abuse by the Church of England of its vulnerable charges and youngsters and vulnerable adults, and not a thing has been done.
Yes.
And until that's done, they should not have access to the public purse. They should not have access to policy making. And until the institutions of that sort, which are built upon othering, remember, the Abrahamist traditions have a foundation, an existential foundation on othering. They identify groups who are, in some way, shape, or form, inferior. And they assume then the mantle of fixing those inferior groups, whether those groups want to hear the message or not. It's a blatant abuse of human rights and indeed of our legal rights, our rights to equality. Also remember that these traditions, they supposedly have a divine creator who discriminates against Hindus and Sikhs and Jains and Buddhists, and their tradition still, as far as the scriptures are concerned, consign us to eternity in hellfire. These
Yeah.
people should not have access to government funds and government and political influence until they qualify under human rights legislation. And until they do, they should be kept firmly at arm's length. And so I'm very much concerned that the church and these institutions has gained access and has managed to get influence into these places. We will find, I'm fairly sure, we will find a report will come out as a result of this conference. And in that report, we will see 2 things. One, we will see the Abrahamist traditions assuming the moral high ground. And from that moral high ground, they will then start to lecture non-Abrahamist traditions on their deficiencies and then put forward solutions. And this will be presented as their solution to a problem, to a trend which seems to be increasing. And what they refuse to recognize, that they themselves are the trend that they are seeking to fix.
Yeah, so it seems like colonialism isn't dead. It's still masquerading under the guise of religion and doing good for the natives that still need them. Um,
It is. The pathway to hell is paved with good intentions and virtue signaling, especially of those who have the most pious of egos. And I'm confident that this conference, the outcome of it, will confirm that to be the case.
yes, yes. Let's see. Slightly diverting away from the conference, actually. Let me pick your brains. This is an issue that does bother many Hindus in India, because there you have politics that for some reason want to take charge of the temples but not the other religious places of worship. How could that be improved, changed, stopped? What are your thoughts on that?
So if I can make a connection with this conference and the phenomenon that you have described, let me put it as starkly as this. Hindus in India live under a state of religious apartheid. They're the indigenous people of that land, and yet they live underneath the colonialist legal system and value system, which was left with one intention, and the intention was to forever weaken the Hindu community. And it still happens. It's so
Sure.
stark and it's so horrific, but there is one aspect which I'd like to just mention, and that is you will never find Amnesty International making a point of the discrimination faced by Hindus in their own ancestral homeland. Why not?
Thank you for all of that information, Banditji, because I know there is a lot of people that still didn't even know this conference was happening. And let's hope it has the ripple effects lasting at least a few weeks, if not a few months. Some changes may take place. And it's a message to Hindu organizations that we need more stringent, more stronger representatives um, that Hindus can hold accountable, especially when given platforms like this, rather than a token gesture. We need some solid action now, and we need changes. We need legislation. We need a real voice representing Hindus. So thank you, Panditji. Are there any final words you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
I think you've brought it to a conclusion on the most important part. We have to put our own house in order. If we don't put our own house in order, then we know that we exist in a hostile environment, an environment which does not want to see Sanatan Dharma, the history of Bharat, the traditions and the wisdom that we have protected for so many years, become widespread. And so we do need protection. We need to be able to demand our rights as taxpayers and as citizens, and that will only happen when we have robust engagement from organizations which are authentic in their representation and, above all, competent in the task that needs to be performed. So thank you, Sloniji, very much for concluding on that point. I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I would even welcome perhaps a future conversation where we can go into a bit more detail, both into the aspects of the religious apartheid in Bharat and the aspect of where our existing organizations perhaps could improve and do better.
Yes. Thank you so much for your time, Panditji. Much, much appreciated. Thank you. Until the next time, Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Shri Krishna, Jai Shri Ram, Sloniji. Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net.